Imagine a boy so poor his family sometimes went to bed hungry. A boy who wore shoes patched with scraps of cloth because buying a new pair was out of the question. A boy who walked through muddy country roads, carrying baskets heavier than his. Small frame, counting every penny as if it were a jewel. Now imagine that same boy, barely educated, no powerful relatives, no family fortune, growing into the man who would reshape the global economy. The man who would become America's first billionaire. That boy was John Davison Rockefeller. To understand Rockefeller's rise, we need to step back into the United States of the mid-19th century. This was not the America of Wall Street skyscrapers, electric lights, or Silicon Valley billionaires. This was an America of dirt roads, flickering oil lamps, and towns carved out of forests by stubborn settlers. The nation was expanding, bursting with ambition, but also weighed down by inequality. Railroads were being laid across the countryside. Factories smoked in growing cities, and immigrants arrived by the thousands in search of work. Yet, for many families, life was fragile. A poor harvest, a bad winter, or an accident could ruin them forever. Rockefeller was born in Richford, New York in 1839, into this world of hardship and uncertainty. His childhood was not the story of comfort or privilege. It was a life sharpened by hunger, discipline, and contradictions. Rockefeller's mother, Eliza, was a devout Baptist woman. She raised her children with strict religious values, honesty, thrift, hard work, and unwavering faith in God. Eliza managed the household with incredible frugality, stretching every coin, patching old clothes, saving scraps of food. She drilled into her children the idea that even a single wasted penny was a sin. His father, William Big Bill Rockefeller, was the opposite. He was a traveling snake oil salesman, a man of charm and deceit. He peddled fake cures and potions, cheated business partners, and lived a double life with multiple families. When he came home, it was often with stories, bravado, and money of questionable origin. When he left, he sometimes took the family's little savings with him. This was the paradox that shaped young John's mind. On one side, a mother preaching moral order, saving every cent, giving to the church. On the other, a father who survived by trickery, risk-taking, and ruthless opportunism. Could it be that Rockefeller inherited both? The outward face of honesty and devotion, and the inner fire of calculation and ambition. Even as a child, Rockefeller stood out. At just 6 years old, he raised turkeys and sold them for profit. He learned early that money was not for spending, it was for multiplying. While other children ate their chickens or spent their coins on candy, John kept his flock alive, reinvested, and sold eggs and birds for more. Neighbors recalled how serious he was, how quietly he studied numbers. He kept notebooks where he tracked even the smallest financial detail: pennies earned, pennies spent. Later in life, Rockefeller would still remember his first small loans to neighbors with pride. He lent out modest sums, charged interest, and discovered the thrill of watching money grow. At just 12 years old, he was already saying, "I have 2 ambitions in life: to make $100,000 and to live to be 100 years old." Both seemed impossible for a poor farm boy in 19th century America. But, as history shows, he nearly achieved both. This was a time of industrial awakening. Steam engines roared across landscapes, factories churned, and inventions were changing daily life. Yet the world was still dim. Literally, most homes were lit by smoky lamps fueled by whale oil, which was expensive and increasingly scarce. When kerosene, distilled from petroleum, emerged as a cheap, cleaner alternative. It promised to light the world, but oil refining was chaotic. Wells gushed wastefully, refineries burned down regularly, and competition was wild. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. Into this storm would step John D. Rockefeller, the quiet bookkeeper with the soul of an empire builder, and here lies the great paradox of his life. Rockefeller was a devout Christian who tithed 10% of his income to the church from his very first paycheck. He believed in modest living, never flaunting wealth with the extravagance of his peers. He loved simple routines, walking, gardening, giving dimes to children he met. But he was also a ruthless monopolist. He orchestrated secret deals with railroads, crushed competitors with predatory pricing, and built Standard Oil into a behemoth that controlled over 90% of America's oil refining. To some, he was a saint of industry, a man who gave back more to society than any other philanthropist of his age. To others, he was the very face of corporate greed, the original robber baron who strangled free markets. So, which was he? A faithful servant of God, or a manipulative titan of industry? A philanthropist who saved lives, or a monopolist who destroyed livelihoods? The truth, as you'll see, is both. But why should we care about Rockefeller now, more than a century later? Because his story is not just about oilets, about power, about money, about the systems that still shape our lives. When we debate whether today's billionaires, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, give enough back to society, we're repeating the same arguments made in Rockefeller's time. When we worry about monopolies like Amazon or Google, we're living in the shadow of Standard Oil. Rockefeller was the prototype, the first great test case of how far one man could bend markets, government, and society to his will. And his legacy forces us to ask, what is the moral responsibility of wealth? So let me ask you, if you were born hungry, would you cling to generosity or wield power without mercy? If you discovered a way to dominate an industry, would you take it, no matter the cost to others? And if you became the richest man in the world, would you spend your fortune on yourself or give it away? These are not just Rockefeller's questions. These are the questions of capitalism itself. And so, our story begins. Not in the glittering halls of New York finance, not in the grand mansions of the Gilded Age, but in a small farmhouse in upstate New York, where a boy named John, with sharp eyes and an iron will, first learned the power of pennies. This is the story of hunger and ambition, of faith and deception, of ruthless power and extraordinary generosity. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller, America's first billionaire. And as you will see, his journey is not just history. It is the blueprint of the modern world. The story begins in a modest farmhouse in Richford, New York. It is the year 1839. America is still young, barely 60 years into its experiment with democracy. The frontier stretches westward, untamed and promising. But for families like the Rockefeller's life is not a story of glory, it is survival. The house creaks in the wind. Its wooden walls are thin, its floors uneven, its cupboards often half empty. In this world of scarcity, a child named John Davison Rockefeller was born, the second of 6 children. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was the bedrock of the home. She was a devout Baptist, stern but loving. Eliza managed every penny with the precision of an accountant. She believed thrift was not just smart, was moral. Waste, in her eyes, was a sin. Neighbors remembered her as the kind of woman who could stretch $1 beyond belief. She reused fabric, patched clothes, until they were more patched than cloth, and stored away coins in secret envelopes labeled for church or for emergencies. It was from Eliza that young John absorbed the idea that money had a soul, that every cent represented labor, sacrifice, and divine trust. But the other half of John's upbringing was William Big Bill Rockefeller. If Eliza was thrift, order, and faith, Big Bill was cunning, charm, and recklessness. A traveling salesman, Big Bill peddled miracle potions, snake oil, some would say. He would swagger into town, selling fake cures for cancer and warts, convincing crowds with his booming voice. Then, when suspicion grew, he would vanish, leaving debts and angry customers behind. He was a gambler, a womanizer, a man who lived by instinct. At one point, he even lived under a false identity. Dr. Livingston, cancer specialist. To his son, he taught not morality, but cheat before you're cheated, he would say. So here was the contradiction. A mother who demanded honesty before God. A father who gloried in deception. Young John stood between these worlds, absorbing both, reconciling neither. Life in the Rockefeller household was not easy. There were nights when the family went hungry. Bread was rationed, meat was rare, and winters stretched long, with little fuel to keep warm. John once recalled, "I had to get along with little. I was trained to economize from the beginning." Poverty is not just about empty stomachs. It leaves an imprint on the mind, a constant anxiety that the next meal, the next season, the next year is never guaranteed. For John, hunger carved two lessons. First, never waste. Second, never stop saving for tomorrow. At just 6 years old, Rockefeller displayed instincts beyond his years. While other children played in fields, he raised turkeys to sell. Think about that for a moment. A child, barely able to write, already practicing reinvestment. Instead of eating the eggs, he hatched them. Instead of consuming, he multiplied. Soon, he was selling birds and eggs at market, counting coins carefully in his small hands. By the time he was a teenager, he had earned enough to lend money to neighbors, charging interest. This was no ordinary boy. Where did he learn it? From his mother's thrift, from his father's cunning, or from hunger itself? John was not the loudest in school, nor the most athletic, but he was meticulous with numbers. Teachers noticed how he loved arithmetic. He found satisfaction in balanced columns adding up neatly, figures aligning perfectly. It was said that from childhood he had the patience of a clerk and the focus of a banker. And in his notebooks, he began recording expenses, savings, and even small loans. This obsession with accounting would later become his weapon. While others in the oil industry chased wild gushers, Rockefeller built ledgers and systems. His fortune would not come from speculation, but from control. At 16, Rockefeller landed his first real job as an assistant bookkeeper. It was a moment he later called the day that determined my career. The salary was modest $50 for 3 months, but to John, it was treasure. He walked to work, brought lunch from home, and saved every spare coin from his first paycheck. He donated a portion to the church. From the second, he began building a small savings fund. He had learned from childhood that money was not for display, it was for purpose. Neighbors recalled seeing John as a boy pick up a penny from the road and place it in his pocket as though it were gold. When asked why he bothered, he replied simply, "Take care of the pennies, and the dollars will take care of themselves." This was not a casual saying. It was his creed. Big Bill was often absent, sometimes for months, sometimes longer. His Unreliability meant that John, even as a boy, felt the burden of responsibility. He helped his mother with chores, managed errands, and often acted as the man of the house. Imagine being 10 years old and knowing you could not rely on your father. Imagine watching your mother struggle to hold the family together. Would it not force you to grow up faster? Rockefeller did not just grow up fast. He grew up calculating, and yet, as disciplined and devout as he appeared, there was something else brewing inside him, a certain steeliness, a certain coldness that would later shock the world, because while hunger can teach compassion, it can also teach ruthlessness. When you've gone without, you learn to grab opportunities before someone else does. The boy who raised turkeys and saved pennies would soon become the man who bought out competitors and bent entire industries to his will. Pause for a moment. If you were that boy walking to bed with an empty stomach, listening to your mother's prayers while your father schemed elsewhere, what would you have become? Would hunger make you generous, or would it make you determined never to be powerless? Again, for John D. Rockefeller, hunger became fuel, and discipline became destiny. By the time Rockefeller left childhood, he was not like other boys. He was quiet, serious, almost secretive. He dressed neatly, spoke carefully, and thought constantly about money, not as wealth to spend, but as power to build. The seeds had been planted, seeds of thrift, seeds of faith, seeds of ambition, and perhaps seeds of ruthlessness. What began in poverty would soon grow into empire, and the world had no idea what was coming. In 1855, John D. Rockefeller was 16 years old, standing on the edge of manhood and on the brink of responsibility. His father, Big Bill, was as unreliable as ever, drifting in and out of the family's life. His mother, Eliza, kept the household afloat through thrift and prayer. But she knew one thing clearly: her eldest son had to find work. John walked the streets of Cleveland, Ohio, day after day, dressed in his only good suit. He carried with him a small, leather-bound notebook where he recorded the businesses he had visited, the doors he had knocked on, and the rejections he had endured. He would later recall those weeks as some of the hardest of his life. For 6 long weeks, he knocked on doors and heard the same answer: "We're not hiring." But John refused to give up. He prayed each morning for guidance, tightened his jaw, and kept going. Finally, one office said yes. The firm was Hewitt and Tutler. Small produce, commission business. They needed an assistant bookkeeper, someone to manage accounts, track sales, and handle correspondence. The pay $50 for 3 months of work. For Rockefeller, it was a fortune. He later remembered the exact date he started as job day, the day that determined my career. While other boys his age celebrated birthdays, John celebrated job day for the rest of his life. It was more important than his birthday, he said, because it was the day he truly began living. At Hewitt and Tuttle, John found his calling. He sat at a tall desk with ink and ledgers, recording figures with perfect precision. Where others might grow bored, John felt satisfaction. Every column that balanced, every account reconciled, gave him joy. He had an extraordinary memory for numbers. He could glance at a balance sheet and notice a discrepancy instantly. His neat handwriting, his tireless work ethic, and his almost religious devotion to accuracy made him stand out. Colleagues noticed that young Rockefeller never wasted time. He did not gossip, he did not complain, and he did not rush. He worked quietly, methodically, as though he understood that every entry in the ledger mattered, from his very first paycheck. Rockefeller demonstrated habits that would define his life. He saved a portion of every dollar. He tithed faithfully to his church. He lived modestly, refusing to indulge in extravagance, when other young men in Cleveland spent their wages on whiskey, tobacco, or weekend amusements. John walked home and deposited his coins into envelopes carefully labeled for savings, charity, and family expenses. He kept a personal ledger that tracked every cent he earned and spent. This ledger would later reveal that from age 16 onward, Rockefeller never once failed to record his finances. He called money a trust from God, not something to squander. At Hewitt and Tuttle, Rockefeller was exposed to the lifeblood of business, credit. Produce firms dealt in large shipments of grain, meat, and supplies. Payments were not always immediate. Success depended on managing trust, extending loans, and calculating risks. John studied these transactions with fascination. He saw how one mistake a shipment delayed, a debtor defaulting could destroy a company. He also saw how careful credit, wisely extended, could build relationships and wealth. This was more than bookkeeping. This was strategy, and Rockefeller absorbed it all. His employers, Hewitt and Tuttle, noticed the young man's seriousness. They entrusted him with greater responsibility, negotiating small deals, calculating freight costs, even managing correspondence with clients. It was here that Rockefeller learned a lesson he would carry for life. Control the details. No expense was too small to monitor, no account too minor to check, because in the world of business, details determined survival. Rockefeller developed the demeanor of a banker, even as a teenager. He was calm, deliberate, and cautious. Unlike his father, who lived by chance, John avoided speculation. He did not gamble. He did not risk recklessly. He preferred slow, steady growth, like planting seeds in good soil and waiting patiently for the harvest. Friends and colleagues remarked on his composure. He never raised his voice. He never acted rashly. Even when faced with setbacks, he responded with patience. One clerk remembered, he was not a boy to be trifled with. He had purpose in every step he took. Pause for a moment and picture yourself at 16. Would you have had the patience to walk the streets for 6 weeks, enduring rejection after rejection? Would you have celebrated the day you got your first job for the rest of your life? Or would you have given up? Rockefeller's discipline wasn't glamorous. It was tedious, methodical, almost dull. But it laid the foundation for everything he would become. With his first wages, Rockefeller did something remarkable. He gave 10% to his church. He then contributed to his family's household expenses. The rest he saved. He once said, "I was trained to economize from the beginning. I saved my money and invested it." That first paycheck was more than income, it was independence. It was proof that he could control his destiny, that he would not be entirely at the mercy of his father's schemes or his family's poverty. Perhaps the most important trait Rockefeller developed at this stage was delayed gratification. While others sought immediate pleasure, he was content to wait. He would invest in turkeys, in loans, in savings, not in fleeting enjoyment. This mindset became the cornerstone of his empire. Standard Oil, after all, was not built overnight. It was built through patience, reinvestment, and control. And it all began with a boy who learned to say, "Not today, tomorrow." As Rockefeller settled into his career, the United States was moving toward civil war. The 1850s were years of deep division slavery, states' rights, and sectional conflict tore at the nation's seams. For Cleveland businessmen, war meant opportunity and risk. Grain shipments, government contracts, and fluctuating markets became the talk of the town. Young Rockefeller observed it all from his desk, sharpening his understanding of how political events shaped economics. When the war finally came, he would face his first major ethical test. Should he enlist or continue building his business? But that comes later in our story. Looking back, Rockefeller himself said, "All the fortune that I have made has not served me so well as the training I had in those early days." At the bookkeeper's desk, he learned, accuracy matters, credit is power, patience is wealth. Details build empires. Every oil refinery, every secret rebate, every act of monopoly he later engineered was built on this quiet foundation of discipline. No one at Hewitt and Tuttle could have guessed that the quiet teenager balancing ledgers would one day control an industry that lit the world. But John Rockefeller already knew. He may not have known the form, but he felt the direction. Every entry in the ledger, every coin saved, every small deal negotiated was all pointing towards something greater. The boy who celebrated Job Day would soon take his first step into entrepreneurship, and that step would change history. So as Act 2 closes, picture John D. Rockefeller, a teenager in a plain suit, hunched over a ledger by candlelight. His pen scratches across the page, recording figures with relentless precision. He is not famous, yet he is not rich yet, but he is disciplined, focused, and patient, and soon he will leave the bookkeeper's desk behind to build his own company, to risk his own money, to seize the opportunities of a nation in turmoil. This was only the beginning. By the early 1860s, John D. Rockefeller was no longer just a boy with a pen and a ledger. He was in his early 20s, steady and serious, his reputation already growing in Cleveland's business circles. The bookkeeper's desk had trained him well, but Rockefeller was not content to remain an employee. He had watched the flow of goods, the movement of credit, the fragile balance of supply and demand. He had studied the way businesses lived or died on slim margins, and he was ready to step out on his own. The time had come to become more than a clerk. It was time to become a partner. In 1859, Rockefeller entered into partnership with Morris B. Clark, a businessman with a small produce commission firm. The company became Clark and Rockefeller. Their business was simple but vital. They bought and sold grain, meat, salt, and other goods commodities that fueled the fast-growing Midwest. The work was demanding. Cleveland was a hub for trade, with goods flowing in by canal and rail, then shipped onward to larger markets. Rockefeller threw himself into the business with characteristic intensity. He tracked shipments, negotiated with clients, and, to form, kept flawless records. Morris Clark later said of his partner, "He was the most careful man I ever knew. He never lost his head. He always did business by the rule of figures and facts." From the beginning, Rockefeller showed a talent for negotiation. He was calm, polite, and soft-spoken, but he never yielded once he had made up his mind. One story tells of a farmer who came to sell produce at a price higher than Rockefeller was willing to pay. Rather than argue, Rockefeller listened quietly, then said, "We cannot give you that price. We will pay you what the goods are worth." The farmer left, angry. Days later, when no one else would buy at his price, the farmer returned and accepted Rockefeller's offer. This was Rockefeller's way, patient, steady, unmoved by pressure. He believed that business was not about emotions, but about discipline. Then came the Civil War. The 1860s tore America apart, reshaping every corner of society. For Cleveland businesses, the war was both a threat and an opportunity. Grain, meat, and supplies were suddenly in enormous demand. Government contracts offered fortunes if one could deliver. Clark and Rockefeller supplied goods to the Union Army, filling orders for pork, flour, and salt. Their profits soared. But the war also brought a moral test. Young men were being drafted to fight. Rockefeller, a devout Christian, opposed violence. He also saw his business as a higher calling, so when his draft number was called, he paid $300 to hire a substitute, legal but controversial option. To some, this made him a coward. To others, it made him practical. For Rockefeller, it was simply business. His duty, he believed, was to provide supplies and manage his growing enterprise, not carry a rifle. By the mid-1860s, Clark and Rockefeller was thriving. Their offices bustled with trade, their ledgers filled with profits. Rockefeller was not flamboyant. He did not spend his earnings on luxuries. Instead, he reinvested, saved, and expanded cautiously. Yet he began to sense something. Produce was profitable, but it was not transformative. The margins were thin, the competition stiff. There was no way to dominate the market, and Rockefeller was not destined to be just another successful merchant. He was destined to build an empire. Around this time, whispers of a new industry were reaching Cleveland: petroleum. In Pennsylvania, oil wells had begun to gush black liquid. At first, many dismissed it as a curiosity, but chemists were discovering that crude oil could be refined into kerosene, clean burning lamp fuel. Whale oil was expensive and scarce. Kerosene promised to light homes across America at a fraction of the cost. The demand was enormous. Too. Most men, oil looked like a gamble. Wells could run dry overnight. Fires destroyed refineries regularly. Prices fluctuated wildly. Many fortunes were made and lost in months. But to Rockefeller, oil was not chaos, was opportunity. In 1863, Clark and Rockefeller made their first investment in an oil refinery, alongside chemist Samuel Andrews. The refinery was small, but it produced kerosene and sold the byproducts for profit. At first, Rockefeller treated it as a side venture. But as he studied the numbers, he saw something astonishing. The profits from oil dwarfed anything he had seen in produce. The margins were higher, the demand insatiable, the potential limitless. The ledger told him what others could not see. Oil was the future, but not everyone agreed. Maurice Clark, Rockefeller's partner, was cautious. He saw oil as risky, unstable, perhaps even reckless. Rockefeller saw it as destiny. The two men argued bitterly. Clark wanted to stick with produce. Rockefeller wanted to go all in on oil. Finally, the partnership could not hold. In 1865, they decided to part ways. At a public auction, Rockefeller bid to buy out Clark's share. Clark expected him to stop at $60,000. Instead, Rockefeller calmly bid $72,500, an enormous sum for the time. The crowd was stunned. Clark walked away. Rockefeller owned the business outright. Years later, Rockefeller would say, "It was the day that determined the course of my life." Imagine yourself at 25 years old. Would you risk everything, every dollar you had saved, every relationship you had built, a volatile new industry no one understood? Maurice Clark walked away, cautious and secure. John D. Rockefeller walked in, bold and steady. Which path would you have chosen? This was Rockefeller's genius. He was not the wild speculator chasing gushers in Pennsylvania. He was not the reckless gambler hoping for quick riches. He was the builder, the man who saw how to bring order to chaos. From his first refinery, he focused on efficiency. He demanded that nothing be wasted. Byproducts others threw away like gasoline or paraffin, Rockefeller found ways to sell. He reinvested every profit back into expansion. Most of all, he believed in control. He would not play the oil game. Like others, he would redefine it. By the time Rockefeller fully committed to oil, he was still only in his mid, but he already carried himself like a seasoned veteran, quiet, cautious, relentless. The hungry boy had become a careful merchant. The careful merchant had become a daring entrepreneur, and soon the daring entrepreneur would become the master. Of oil, what began with turkeys and pennies was now about to reshape the world. The year was 1863. Cleveland was buzzing with rumors of a new liquid gold, oil. Pennsylvania's oil fields were booming. Farmers who had once scratched the earth for corn now struck black fountains of crude. Speculators rushed in by the thousands, chasing fortunes. Wells erupted, fortunes rose overnight, and just as quickly, they fell. But the truth was, the oil industry was a mess. Drillers wasted barrels upon barrels of crude because storage was scarce. Transportation was unreliable. Refineries were little more than wooden shacks, prone to fire and explosions. Prices fluctuated daily, sometimes hourly. For every man who struck it rich, 10 more went bankrupt. To most, oil looked like chaos. To Rockefeller, it looked like opportunity. In 1863, Rockefeller then, in partnership with Morris Clark, invested in a small Cleveland refinery managed by chemist Samuel Andrews. Andrews knew how to turn crude oil into kerosene, the clean lamp fuel that was already replacing whale oil across America. The refinery was modest, but its profits were staggering compared to produce. In their first year, Rockefeller saw returns that dwarfed anything grain or pork could deliver. He ran the numbers carefully, and they spoke clearly. Oil was not a gamble, it was the future. Still, Morris Clark remained unconvinced. To him, oil was unstable, risky, dangerous. But John had made up his mind. In 1865, the partnership between Rockefeller and Clark came to a breaking point. They could not agree on the future of the business. Clark wanted to focus on produce. Rockefeller wanted oil, and only oil, so they held an auction to dissolve the partnership. The bidding was tense. Clark believed Rockefeller would hesitate, but John sat calmly, raising his bids methodically, never flinching. At $72,500, the gavel fell. Rockefeller had bought Clark out. Later, Rockefeller recalled, "It was the day that determined the course of my life." From that moment on, Rockefeller's destiny was tied to oil. While others chased gushers and speculated wildly, Rockefeller had a different approach. He was not interested in drilling for oil. That, to him, was gambling. Wells could run dry in weeks, but refining, that was stable, predictable, controllable. He once said, "Refining is where the profits lie." So Rockefeller focused on order. He demanded that his refineries waste nothing. Every byproduct had to be used: gasoline, tar, paraffin, naphtha. Everything could be sold. He studied costs obsessively, cutting inefficiencies others ignored. If a rival lost 40% of the oil in waste, Rockefeller saved it, sold it, and turned it into profit. His motto was clear: turn waste into wealth. Visitors to his refineries noticed something striking. They were clean, organized, almost military. In discipline. Every barrel was accounted for, every shipment tracked. Rockefeller demanded bulk buying to lower costs. He negotiated relentlessly with suppliers. He reinvested profits not in mansions or luxuries, but in new equipment, more storage tanks, bigger refineries. To him, every penny saved was not just profited, was a weapon against his competitors. In 1867, Rockefeller found the man who would become his greatest ally, Henry Flagler. Flagler was everything Rockefeller needed. A brilliant businessman, calm and visionary, with a knack for raising capital. He shared Rockefeller's obsession with efficiency and control. Where Rockefeller was cautious, Flagler was bold. Together, they were unstoppable. Flagler also brought something Rockefeller desperately needed: money. Oil refining required enormous capital to build storage tanks, pipelines, and distribution networks. Flagler secured investments and structured deals that gave Standard Oil the financial muscle to expand. Rockefeller would later say of Flagler, "He was the brains behind the structure. I was the financier." Their partnership was seamless, built on mutual trust and shared ambition. With Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler united, they reorganized the business as Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler. It would soon take on a name the world would never forget: Standard Oil. The name itself was a statement. While others operated makeshift refineries with inconsistent quality, Rockefeller promised standardization. Every barrel of kerosene from his refineries would be pure, reliable, safe. Consumers could trust it. That consistency built loyalty and dominance, but efficiency alone would not secure Rockefeller's empire. The true masterstroke was in transportation. Oil had to be shipped by rail, by barge, across the nation. Shipping costs were enormous, and most refiners paid whatever the railroads demanded. Not Rockefeller. He negotiated secret rebate special deals that gave Standard Oil lower rates than any competitor. Railroads agreed because Rockefeller guaranteed them massive, steady shipments. This advantage was devastating. While rivals struggled with high costs, Rockefeller shipped cheaper, undercut their prices, and forced them out of business or into his arms through buyouts. It was ruthless. It was brilliant. It was Rockefeller to stop and consider. Was this genius or cheating? If you had the chance to strike a secret deal that crushed your rivals, would you take it? Was Rockefeller playing for raw, bending the rules of capitalism? The answer depends on where you stand. To his competitors, it was predatory. To Rockefeller, it was simply smart business. By the late 1860s, Cleveland had become the refining capital of American Rockefeller, its master. His refineries dominated the landscape. His shipments filled the railroads. His profits soared. Every year, he reinvested, expanded, absorbed more competitors. The boy who once raised turkeys now commanded an industry. Flagler's genius went beyond finance. He helped design the corporate structure of Standard Oil. Rather than chaotic partnerships, they created a system of trusts, boards, and subsidiaries that allowed them to control vast operations with precision. This was revolutionary. Standard Oil was not just a company, it was a machine, and every part moved under Rockefeller's control. By the early 1870s, Rockefeller and Flagler controlled nearly 10% of America's oil refining capacity. Within just a few years, that number would climb to 90%. They had taken an industry born in chaos and bent it to their will. But power attracts enemies, and as Standard Oil grew, so too did suspicion, resentment, and backlash. The world would soon discover that John D. Rockefeller was not just building a company, he was building a monopoly. By the late 1860s, the American landscape was changing as rapidly as Rockefeller's ambitions. The railroads had become the arteries of the nation, carrying coal, grain, timber, livestock, and now oil across vast distances. Steel tracks linked cities like veins pumping lifeblood into the body of industry. Whoever controlled shipping controlled the future, and John D. Rockefeller understood this better than anyone. Oil refining was profitable, yes, but it was shipping that determined who survived and who perished. Transportation costs could swallow profits whole. In an industry of razor-thin margins, a few cents difference per barrel could decide life or death for a refinery. To most refiners, this was a constant headache. To Rockefeller, it was an opportunity. Rockefeller's genius was not just in refining oil efficiently, it was in negotiating power with the railroads. He approached them calmly, methodically, offering something they craved: volume. While small refiners shipped irregularly, Rockefeller guaranteed massive, steady shipments. In return, he demanded lower freight rate, secret rebates that slashed his costs below those of his competitors. But he went further. He also demanded drawbacks, payments from the railroads based on the shipments of his rivals. Imagine that every time a competitor shipped oil, Rockefeller got money back. It was legal at the time, but it was devastating. Standard Oil could cut its prices, underbid rivals, and still profit while competitors bled to death. To other refiners, this felt like war. They called it unfair, predatory, even criminal. But Rockefeller remained unmoved. To him, it was simply efficiency, aligning himself with the railroads, reducing waste, and ensuring stability in a chaotic industry. Competition is a sin, Rockefeller would later say. Whether he meant it literally or not, his actions showed he believed it. With his shipping costs slashed, Rockefeller could do what no rival dared: lower his prices below cost. He would target a competitor, cut prices in that market until the rival was ruined, then quietly buy them out. Once the rival was gone, he raised prices back to profitable levels. This tactic, later known as predatory pricing, was brutal, effective, and nearly impossible to fight. One by one, Cleveland refiners fell. Some sold willingly, taking Rockefeller's offer of Standard Oil stock in exchange for independence. Others resisted, but found themselves unable to compete. What made Rockefeller so frightening was not anger or aggression, but calm inevitability. He never shouted, never raged, never gloated. He spoke softly, politely, and presented competitors with a choice: join Standard Oil and share in its prosperity, or fight and be destroyed. It was said that meeting Rockefeller in negotiations was like facing a stone wall. You could argue, you could plead, but nothing moved him. His mind was fixed, his calculations precise, and in the end, Mose chose to sell. In 1871, Rockefeller's ambitions reached new heights. He joined forces with major railroads to create the South Improvement Company, a secret cartel designed to fix shipping rates and crush independent refiners. Under the agreement, Standard Oil would receive massive rebates, while competitors would pay inflated rates. Worse, Rockefeller would receive information about competitors' shipments, giving him insider knowledge of their business. When news of the deal leaked, outrage erupted. Independent refiners and the public were furious. Protests spread across Pennsylvania. The railroads quickly backed down, and the South Improvement Company collapsed. But for Rockefeller, the message was clear. The railroads were his partners, not his enemies. And even in failure, the attempt gave him invaluable information about the industry. Rockefeller wasted no time. In 1872, he launched what became known as the Cleveland Massacre. In just 6 weeks, Standard Oil absorbed 22 out of 26 rival refineries in Cleveland. 6 weeks. The method was always the same. Offer Standard Oil stock in exchange for their business. Promise stability, efficiency, and profit. If they resisted, slash prices until they had no choice. Many refiners walked into Rockefeller's office, proud businessmen, and walked out relieved, even grateful to be part of his empire. They may have lost independence, but they gained security by the end of the massacre. Rockefeller controlled nearly all of Cleveland's refining capacity. The city had become the heart of Standard Oil's empire. Pause and imagine yourself as one of those small refiners in Cleveland. You've built your business with sweat and sacrifice. Your family depends on it. Then Rockefeller arrives, polite but unyielding. He offers you a deal. Join Standard Oil or be crushed. What would you do? Sell your life's work to save yourself or fight a battle you knew you couldn't win? Cleveland was just the beginning. From there, Standard Oil expanded to Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York. By controlling refining in key cities, Rockefeller controlled not just supply, but markets. His empire was growing vertically too. He bought pipelines, storage facilities, tank cars, and docks. Every link in the oil chain, from well to lamp, was falling under his control. By the mid-1870s, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of America's refining capacity. It was not just a company, it was a system, a machine, an empire. Yet even as his empire grew, Rockefeller lived modestly. He did not flaunt his wealth with mansions or jewels. He dressed plainly, ate simple meals, walked to work. He attended church faithfully, taught Sunday school, and gave to charity. This baffled his critics. How could a man so ruthless in business appear so saintly in life? Was it hypocrisy, or was it conviction? The paradox deepened. Rockefeller the devout Christian, Rockefeller the monopolist, which was the real man. But Rockefeller's reliance on railroads carried risks. Competitors who could not fight Standard Oil on price began looking for alternatives: pipelines, independent shipping, new routes. The railroads themselves grew wary of how much power Rockefeller wielded. After all, Standard Oil's domination meant they too were becoming dependent on him. The seeds of future conflict were planted. But for now, Rockefeller reigned supreme. By the close of the 1870s, Rockefeller had achieved what no one thought possible. He had tamed chaos. He had bent an entire industry to his will. He had transformed oil from a wild gamble into a system of order and profit. But power breeds enemies. Journalists, politicians, and rivals began to take notice. How could one man, one company, control so much of the nation's lifeblood? The whispers of monopoly grew louder, and soon the fight would no longer be in the boardrooms of Cleveland, but in the halls of Congress and the Supreme Court. Cleveland, in the winter of 1872, was a city of smoke and ambition. The streets bustled with wagons hauling barrels of oil to refineries. Chimneys belched dark fumes into the cold sky. Nearly 30 independent refiners dotted the landscape, each scrambling to survive in a volatile industry. To them, business was hard, but it was honest. To John D. Rockefeller, it was inefficient, and he intended to change it. What came next would enter American business history under a chilling name: the Cleveland Massacre. Only months before, Rockefeller's secret alliance with the railroads, the South Improvement Company, had collapsed in scandal. Independent refiners had protested, farmers rioted, and the scheme was abandoned. But though the public had won a battle, Rockefeller had learned something valuable. The industry was fragile, disorganized, and terrified of uncertainty. With the right pressure, it could be bent or broken. And so he devised a new plan. Not a public alliance, but a quiet campaign. Instead of competing with refiners, he would eliminate them. Rockefeller moved quickly and quietly. He sent representatives to each refinery in Cleveland with a simple message: join Standard Oil and secure your future, or fight and be crushed. The offer was generous on the surface. Rockefeller did not always pay in cash. Often he offered Standard Oil stock, a piece of the empire. Those who accepted found themselves wealthier than they had imagined, their skills absorbed into the machine. But for those who refused, the consequences were swift. Standard Oil slashed its prices in their markets, undercutting them until bankruptcy loomed. One by one, they folded. In just 6 weeks, Rockefeller absorbed 22 of the 26 refineries in Cleveland. It was breathtaking. A corporate conquest unlike anything America had seen. Men who had once considered themselves proud entrepreneurs now found themselves sitting across from Rockefeller, signing away their independence. Some cursed him, some thanked him. Most simply admitted they had no choice. By the end of the campaign, Cleveland was no longer a city of independent refiners. It was Standard Oil's capital. What made Rockefeller's consolidation so effective was not rage or arrogance, but calm calculation. He did not storm in with bluster. He listened patiently, spoke softly, and presented the facts. Competing against Standard Oil was futile. Joining meant profit, stability, even prestige. He turned rivals into partners, enemies into allies. He absorbed not only their assets, but their talent. Chemists, managers, engineers, all brought into Standard Oil's fold. It wasn't just about eliminating competition, it was about consolidating knowledge and expertise. Pause for a moment. If you were the owner of a small refinery in 1872, what would you have done? Hold on to your independence, risking ruin as Standard Oil slashed prices around you? Or sell to Rockefeller, sacrificing freedom but gaining wealth and security? There was no middle ground. By the close of 1872, Rockefeller controlled 85% of Cleveland's refining capacity, and Cleveland wasn't just any city. It was one of the most important refining hubs in America. Control Cleveland, and you controlled the arteries of the oil trade. From here, Standard Oil expanded outward to Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York, repeating the same formula. One by one, local refiners were swallowed, but Rockefeller faced a new challenge. As his empire spread across states, the law limited how much a single company could control outside its home state. The solution was brilliant. The trust under this system, stockholders in dozens of affiliated companies surrendered their shares to a small group of trustees, led, of course, by Rockefeller himself. In exchange, they received trust certificates. This gave Rockefeller centralized control over a vast network of companies while appearing, on paper, as if they were independent. It was the legal sleight of hand that made Standard Oil untouchable. The trust became so notorious that it gave birth to a new word still used today. With Cleveland as his stronghold and the trust as his weapon, Rockefeller turned Standard Oil into a machine of breathtaking power. Pipelines, storage tanks, and rail cars under his control. Shipping rates rigged in his favor. Refineries operating at unmatched efficiency. Byproducts sold profitably instead of wasted. Everything was calculated, everything precise. Waste was sin. Efficiency was salvation. Standard Oil was not just a company. It was the oil industry itself. And yet, while rivals painted him as a tyrant, Rockefeller maintained an almost saintly public persona. He lived modestly, avoided alcohol, attended church, and gave to charity. He taught Sunday school, spoke softly, and insisted his fortune was guided by God's will. Was he a humble servant of faith, or a cold monopolist crushing free enterprise? The paradox was becoming impossible to ignore. For small refiners and farmers, Standard Oil became a symbol of oppression. Prices might be low, but independence was gone. The industry was no longer free. It was controlled by one man and his circle of trustees. Journalists began to take notice. Politicians muttered about monopoly. Competitors whispered of rebellion. The seeds of backlash were planted. But for now, Rockefeller reigned supreme. So what do you think? Was Rockefeller saving the industry from chaos by bringing order, efficiency, and lower prices? Or was he strangling the American dream of independent business? History, as you'll see, never fully made up its mind by the late 1870s. Rockefeller controlled nearly 90% of America's refining capacity. No single company in history had ever held such power over a vital resource. Standard Oil had become, in effect, a nation within a nation, with its own laws, its own system, its own authority. But monopolies cannot rise without awakening enemies. The louder Rockefeller's dominance grew, the louder the calls for reform, and soon his empire would face its greatest test, not from rivals in Cleveland, but from the United States government itself. By the late 1870s, John D. Rockefeller had already conquered Cleveland. The Cleveland massacre had left Standard Oil with nearly total control of refining in the city, and soon the company stretched its grip across Pennsylvania, New York, and beyond. But for Rockefeller, Cleveland was only the beginning. He envisioned something larger than a regional monopoly. He wanted Standard Oil to be the nervous system of a nation, an organism that touched every town, every factory, every home. And in less than a decade, he would make that vision reality. The United States was still a patchwork of local industries. Railroads were fragmented, pipelines were limited, and most businesses thought in terms of towns, not nations. Rockefeller thought differently. He saw oil not as a local commodity, but as the lifeblood of the modern world. And he was determined that Standard Oil would pump that lifeblood everywhere. So he began acquiring control across the entire oil supply chain, pipelines, Standard Oil. Built and bought networks that carried crude directly from wells to refineries, bypassing railroads when necessary. Competitors who relied on public pipelines suddenly found themselves cut off. Storage tanks. Standard Oil owned vast tank farms, giving it leverage over timing. By holding back supply, Rockefeller could manipulate prices at will. Tank cars and barges. Even the barrels themselves were standardized, stamped with Standard Oil's brand, symbols of quality and dominance. By controlling not just refining, but every link in the chain, Rockefeller created what modern economists call vertical integration. He didn't just compete in the market. He owned the market, but Rockefeller's ambitions did not stop at the US border. By the 1880s, Standard Oil kerosene was lighting homes not just in America, but around the world, in Europe, Asia, and South America. American barrels of kerosene were stacked on docks from Hamburg to Shanghai. Missionaries in Africa carried lamps stamped with the Standard Oil sealed dot at its peak. Standard Oil controlled about 70% of the world's oil trade. Think about that for a moment. One man, one company, controlling the light in homes across continents. To farmers in Russia, to villagers in India, to shopkeepers in Brazil. Standard Oil was not just a product. It was modernity itself, a symbol of America's industrial power. As Rockefeller's empire grew, so too did the reputations of other industrial giants. Andrew Carnegie ruled steel. He believed in efficiency, in cutting costs to the bone, in reinvesting profits for expansion. In many ways, he and Rockefeller were cut from the same cloth, frugal in personal life, relentless in business. Yet they eyed each other warily. Steel and oil were not directly competitive, but each man symbolized a different pathway to power. Then there was J.P. Morgan, the banker. Unlike Rockefeller or Carnegie, Morgan did not build factories or refineries. He built financial empires. With cold eyes and iron discipline, Morgan controlled the flow of capital, rescuing railroads, consolidating industries, and bending markets to his will. Rockefeller knew he needed allies. Railroads, steel, banking, these were forces too large to ignore. So he struck deals, aligned interests, and ensured that Standard Oil remained indispensable. It was whispered that no major financial move in America could happen without Morgan's approval, and no industrial move without Rockefeller's. Together, they were the twin pillars of American capitalism. With wealth came political power. Rockefeller never sought elected office. He disliked the spotlight, preferred quiet homes and prayer meetings. But behind the scenes, Standard Oil money flowed into campaigns, into lobbying, into influence. Politicians who opposed Standard Oil often found their careers mysteriously shortened. Those who supported it found themselves well-funded. Rockefeller did not need to make speeches. His money did the talking in whispers and in headlines. He became something larger than a businessman. He became a kingmaker, a man whose nod could shape policy, whose influence reached from state houses to the White House. And yet, to see him in daily life, one would hardly guess his power. Rockefeller still lived with remarkable modesty. He wore simple black suits, ate plain meals, and walked with a quiet step. He taught Sunday school, gave coins to children, and lived in what many would consider middle-class restraint. It was as if he wanted the world to see two Rockefellers, the humble Christian servant and the ruthless monopolist who bent nations to his will. The paradox deepened with every passing year, but as Standard Oil spread, so did resentment. Independent refiners accused Rockefeller of strangling competition. Farmers accused him of manipulating railroad rates. Newspapers began to ask how much power was too much for one man. Ida Tarbell, the daughter of a Pennsylvania oilman ruined by Rockefeller, would later dedicate her career to exposing Standard Oil's tactics in her groundbreaking investigative journalism. Her words painted Rockefeller not as a saint, but as a predator cloaked in prayer. For now, however, Rockefeller was untouchable. His wealth, his networks, his alliances with railroads and financiers made him almost immune to challenge. So, let me ask you, if you were John D. Rockefeller, would you have stopped here content with national dominance, international trade, and political influence? Or would you have pressed forward, seeking ever more power until the entire system bent to your control? For Rockefeller, there was only one answer: more, always more. By the 1880s, Standard Oil's dominance was staggering, 90% of U.S. refining capacity, thousands of miles of pipelines, fleet upon fleet of tank cars and ships, billions in today's dollars in annual revenue. No other company in history had ever held such power over a single industry. Standard Oil was not simply a business. It was a state within a state, with its own army of clerks, lawyers, engineers, and managers. Some Americans admired it, pointing to cheaper prices for kerosene and the stability Rockefeller brought. Others feared it, warning that democracy itself was threatened by such concentrated power as Rockefeller stood at the height of his empire. He could look out across the world and see his mark everywhere. Lamps glowing in distant villages, refineries roaring in Cleveland and New Jersey, tankers carrying his product across oceans. But the higher a mountain rises, the stronger the winds that batter it. The progressive era was dawning. Reformers, journalists, and politicians were sharpening their knives. And soon, the United States government itself would turn its full attention to Standard Oil. The question was no longer whether Rockefeller could dominate an industry. It was whether America could survive one man's domination. By the 1880s, John D. Rockefeller was at the height of his power. Standard Oil controlled nearly 90% of the refining industry in the United States. His kerosene lit homes across the globe. His tank cars dominated the railroads. His pipelines cut across states like arteries to his supporters. Rockefeller was a genius, the man who had brought order, efficiency, and cheaper prices to an industry once chaotic and wasteful. But to his enemies, he was something else, a tyrant cloaked in piety, a monopolist strangling the American dream. And now, for the first time, the nation was ready to fight back. Small refiners had long complained of Rockefeller's predatory tactics. Farmers accused him of manipulating freight rates. Politicians grumbled about his influence. But whispers alone could not topple Standard Oil. Rockefeller was too powerful, too entrenched. What was needed was a voice, clear, credible, relentless, to rally public opinion against him. That voice belonged to a woman, Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell was no ordinary journalist. She was the daughter of a Pennsylvania oilman whose small refinery had been crushed by Rockefeller's tactics. She had grown up watching her family struggle, their dreams smothered by the machine of Standard Oil. When she became a writer for McClure's magazine, she brought with her not only sharp intellect, but also deep personal motivation. In 1902, she began publishing a series of articles that would shake the nation, the history of the Standard Oil Company. Tarbell's expose was meticulous. She interviewed former employees, dug through court records, examined shipping contracts. Piece by piece, she laid bare Rockefeller's methods, the secret rebates, the predatory pricing, the ruthless buyouts. Her words were sharp, but her tone was calm. That was her brilliance. She did not rant, she presented evidence. And America listened. Tarbell's series became a sensation. Readers were stunned. The image of Rockefeller as a devout, modest man of faith began to crumble. Instead, he emerged in the public imagination as the archetype of the robber baron. Editorial cartoons depicted him as an octopus, its tentacles wrapped around pipelines, railroads, and even the Capitol itself. Preachers denounced him from pulpits. Farmers cursed his name. For the first time, Rockefeller felt the weight of true public hatred. His fortune had made him untouchable in business. But in the court of public opinion, the tide was turning. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal law aimed at curbing monopolies. Its language was broad. Any combination in restraint of trade or commerce was illegal. At first, the law was weak. Enforcement was sporadic, and many doubted it could touch giants like Standard Oil. But the legal foundation had been laid, and as public outrage grew, the government began to act. In the 1890s and early 1900s, state governments and federal authorities launched investigations into Standard Oil. Lawsuits multiplied. Regulators accused Rockefeller of crushing competition, manipulating markets, and conspiring with railroads. Standard Oil fought back with its army of lawyers. They argued that the company had not harmed the public. After all, hadn't kerosene? Prices dropped dramatically under Rockefeller's reign. Hadn't efficiency improved? It was a compelling defense, but it could not erase the image Tarbell had painted, nor the growing anger of reformers. This was the dawn of the progressive era, a movement that sought to rein in the excesses of industrial capitalism. Reformers demanded cleaner government, labor protections, and an end to monopolies. For them, Standard Oil was the ultimate villain. Breaking it apart became a symbol of restoring fairness to American life, and soon the battle would reach the highest court in the land. In 1906, the federal government filed its most serious case yet, United States v. Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. The case dragged on for years, filled with testimony, evidence, and fierce arguments. At its heart was a simple question: had Standard Oil violated the Sherman Antitrust Act by restraining trade and creating a monopoly? The answer seemed obvious to many. Standard Oil was, by every definition, a monopoly. But would the courts dare dismantle the most powerful corporation in America? Throughout the trial, Rockefeller remained astonishingly calm. He had, by then, largely withdrawn from daily management, focusing more on philanthropy and his family. Reporters hounded him, but he rarely showed emotion. When asked about the case, he would smile faintly and say things like, "Standard Oil has been a blessing to the nation." It was as if he knew that, whatever happened, his fortune was secure. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict in a landmark decision. The court ruled that Standard Oil was indeed in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The justices declared the company an unreasonable restraint of trade and ordered it to be broken up. Standard Oil would be divided into 34 separate companies, each independent of the others. The monopoly was shattered. But here is the irony. The breakup that was meant to humble Rockefeller only made him richer. Each of the 34 new companies quickly flourished in competition. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Others grew into BP and Amoco, and Rockefeller, who still held massive shares in all of them, saw his wealth multiply. His net worth tripled in the years following the breakup. The government had destroyed his company, and in the process made him the richest man in the world. To reformers, the ruling was a triumph. It proved that no man, no company, was above the law. The era of unchecked monopolies was over, and the government had asserted its power to regulate big business. But to Rockefeller supporters, it was proof of his genius. Even when defeated, he found victory. Even when broken, his empire grew stronger. So what do you think? Was the breakup of Standard Oil justice at last, a victory for democracy against monopoly? Or was it a hollow gesture, proving that wealth and power always find a way to win? Rockefeller himself showed no bitterness. He accepted the decision with serenity, as if he had always known it would come. By 1911, the age of Standard Oil was over, but Rockefeller's story was far from finished. With his fortune secured beyond imagination, he turned increasingly to a new mission, giving it away, and just as he had transformed the oil industry, John D. Rockefeller would now transform the very idea of philanthropy itself. By 1911, the Supreme Court had broken up Standard Oil into 34 companies. But John D. Rockefeller, now in his early 70s, did not rage against the ruling. He accepted it calmly. His fortune had multiplied, his empire lived on in fragments, and his place in history was secure. And now, for the first time in decades, Rockefeller turned his gaze away from business. He had built his empire. He had fought his wars. The question that remained was, what should a man do with so much wealth? Rockefeller had always believed that money was a trust from God. From his very first paycheck as a teenage bookkeeper, he had tithed to his church. He had lived modestly, avoided extravagance, and kept strict accounts of every dollar. But now his fortune was vast, greater than any single individual had ever held. In today's terms, more than $400 billion. To simply hoard it would be obscene. To waste it on personal luxury would betray the values his mother had instilled in him. Instead, Rockefeller decided to apply the same discipline he had brought to oil refining to giving away money. Philanthropy, he believed, should be systematic, scientific, and aimed at solving root problems, not just patching symptoms. One of Rockefeller's first great ventures in philanthropy was education. He had long believed in the power of knowledge. In the 1890s, he had funded the creation of the University of Chicago. At the time, the city had no major university, and skeptics laughed at the idea that a Baptist school in the Midwest could ever rival Harvard or Yale. But Rockefeller poured millions into it. He demanded excellence, recruited top scholars, and gave the university an endowment that allowed it to thrive. Within decades, the University of Chicago had become one of the leading research institutions in the world. This was Rockefeller's model, not scattered gifts, but concentrated investment in institutions that could last for generations. He also funded Spelman Seminary in Atlanta, supporting education for African American women, a radical act in the segregated South. 2. Rockefeller education was not charity. It was capital invested in human minds. But perhaps Rockefeller's greatest legacy lay in medicine and public health. At the turn of the century, disease was rampant. Hookworm plagued the American South, leaving thousands of children weak and stunted. Malaria and yellow fever haunted the tropics. Medical research was fragmented, underfunded, and often unscientific. Rockefeller decided to change that in 1901. He established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York City, modeled after Europe's great research laboratories. It became the first biomedical research center in the United States. Scientists there would go on to develop treatments for meningitis, discover breakthroughs in virology, and lay foundations for modern medicine. Then, in 1913, Rockefeller created the Rockefeller Foundation, his most ambitious project. Its mission: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. The foundation launched massive campaigns against hookworm, malaria, and yellow fever. In the American South, children were dewormed by the millions, lifting communities out of lethargy and poverty. Abroad, Rockefeller's funds sent doctors across Asia, Africa, and Latin America to fight epidemics. In an era before global health organizations, The Rockefeller Foundation was the closest thing the world had to a World Health Organization. The foundation also revolutionized science and higher education. It funded medical schools, established public health programs, and supported agricultural research. It invested in institutions like Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and Yale, transforming them into global leaders in research. Rockefeller believed philanthropy should attack root causes. Instead of handing out food, fund agricultural science. Instead of just treating disease, fund the research that eradicates it. Instead of building one hospital, create a system of medical schools to train doctors for generations. This was philanthropy, not as charity, but as strategy. Yet even as he gave away hundreds of millions, Rockefeller never lost his peculiar personal habits. He famously carried rolls of dimes in his pocket. Everywhere he went, he handed them to children, strangers, even reporters. Some saw it as eccentric, others saw it as symbolic. The billionaire who gave away fortunes still cared about pennies. Was it generosity, quirkiness, or perhaps a reminder that in Rockefeller's world, even the smallest coin mattered? Not everyone was impressed. Some critics argued that Rockefeller's philanthropy was nothing more than reputation, laundering an attempt to cleanse the sins of Standard Oil. How could a man who had crushed competitors now claim to serve humanity? Others feared his foundations wielded too much influence. Was it right, they asked, for one man's fortune to shape the direction of science, education, and global health? The paradox persisted. Rockefeller the robber baron, Rockefeller the benefactor. Which was the real man? So, what do you think? If you had unimaginable wealth, how would you use it? Would you build schools, fight disease, create foundations, or would you spend it on yourself and your family? And here's the harder question. Does great philanthropy erase ruthless business tactics? Or should we judge Rockefeller by how he made his money, not how he gave it away? The Rockefeller Foundation would go on to transform entire fields. It funded research that led to the Green Revolution in agriculture, feeding billions. It supported development of vaccines and treatments that saved millions of lives. It shaped the model of modern philanthropy, inspiring figures like Andrew Carnegie in his libraries and, a century later, Bill Gates in global health. Through the foundation, Rockefeller's money outlived him. Long after his empire was broken up, his wealth continued to shape the world. In his later years, Rockefeller spent more time at his estate in Pocantico Hills, New York. He lived to see his philanthropy take root, his fortune reshape medicine and education, and his name etched into institutions worldwide. Visitors described him as frail, often seated in a rocking chair, handing out dimes to children, smiling quietly as though amused by his own reputation. Did he ever regret the ruthlessness of Standard Oil? Perhaps. Did he find peace in his philanthropy? Perhaps. He rarely said, but in the end, Rockefeller had achieved something extraordinary. He had not only built one of the greatest fortunes in history, he had also redefined what could be done with it. By the 1910s, John D. Rockefeller was no longer the day-to-day commander of Standard Oil. The empire he had built was now in the hands of others. Split into 34 companies after the Supreme Court ruling of 1911, yet Rockefeller himself had emerged wealthier than ever, his fortune multiplying as the new companies Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and others grew. For the first time in his life, Rockefeller could step back. The battles of railroads and refineries were over. The court fights were settled. The question of monopoly had been decided, and so began his final chapter, a man retired, enormously wealthy, yet strangely modest. Living in the long twilight of his years, Rockefeller retreated to his grand estate at Kykut, in Pocantico Hills, New York. The estate overlooked the Hudson River, with sprawling gardens, fountains, and art collections. It was palatial, yet Rockefeller himself lived within it with surprising restraint. He rose early, followed a simple diet, and devoted his time to family, philanthropy, and quiet hobbies. He took long walks in the gardens, played golf, a game he adored, and often sang hymns in his spare time. Visitors were struck by his simplicity. He wore plain black suits, not the extravagant fashion of other millionaires of the Gilded Age. He ate modest meals. He avoided alcohol and tobacco, and, of course, he kept meticulous records of everything, even in retirement. Rockefeller became famous for a curious habit, carrying rolls of dimes in his pockets, wherever he went. He handed them out to children, to strangers, to servants. Some laughed at the eccentricity. Others saw symbolism. The billionaire who gave away millions still valued the smallest coin. It was more than a quirk. It reflected the lesson his mother had drilled into him as a boy. Every penny matters, even after creating the largest fortune. In history, Rockefeller never lost his fascination with the smallest unit of money. Another quirk was his obsession with health. He experimented with diets, followed strict routines, and believed discipline could prolong life. He often told friends that his goal was to live to 100, though retired from business. Rockefeller closely monitored the work of the Rockefeller Foundation. He saw it as his true legacy. Letters and reports flowed to Kykut from around the world, updates on medical campaigns in Asia, education projects in the American South, agricultural research in Latin America. Rockefeller read them with satisfaction. To him, these were the dividends of his fortune, not dollars, but human progress. He once said, "The best philanthropy is constantly in search of the finalities, a search for the root causes, an attempt to cure evils at their source." As decades passed, the fierce hatred that once surrounded Rockefeller began to soften. The investigative fury of Ida Tarbell had faded. The caricatures of him as an octopus strangling democracy were replaced by images of the old man handing out dimes and funding hospitals. Children saw him as a kindly grandfather figure. Communities remembered his gifts, schools, universities, public health initiatives. By the 1920s, Rockefeller had become less a villain and more a legend. Was it forgiveness, or simply the way time reshapes memory? Rockefeller took joy in his family. His only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., carried on much of the philanthropic work. Funding projects like Rockefeller Center in New York City, his grandsons, Nelson, David Winthrop, and others, would go on to play major roles in politics, banking, and culture. The Rockefeller name became synonymous not just with wealth, but with influence woven into the fabric of American life. Rockefeller lived to see astonishing change. Born in 1839 in a farmhouse with oil lamps and dirt roads, he died in an America of skyscrapers, automobiles, airplanes, and radio. The industry he had helped create, oil-powered cars, factories, and the machinery of a modern world. He nearly achieved his boyhood goal of living to 100. On May 23, 1937, John D. Rockefeller died at the age of 97 at his estate in Florida. The world reacted with awe. Here was a man who had risen from poverty to become the richest individual in modern history, a man who had both crushed competitors and given away vast sums to save lives. So, who was John D. Rockefeller, really? To some, he remains the ruthless monopolist, the robber baron who crushed free competition and bent the economy to his will. To others, he is the father of modern philanthropy, the man who funded universities, eradicated diseases, and invested in human progress. Both images are true. His life was a tapestry of contradictions, ruthless yet devout, calculating yet generous, feared yet admired. His dual legacy forces us to ask timeless questions. Can wealth created ruthlessly be redeemed by generosity? Do the ends justify the means? Should we judge a man by how he made his money, or by how he used it? What do you think? If you had lived in Rockefeller's time, would you have cursed him as a monopolist or praised him as a benefactor? And today, when billionaires like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Elon Musk follow in his footsteps, do we still wrestle with the same questions of power, wealth, and responsibility? Picture Rockefeller in his twilight years, an old man in a rocking chair, thin and pale, with a faint smile on his lips. Children approach him, and he hands them each a dime. He hums a hymn softly to himself, perhaps thinking of his mother's lessons on thrift, or perhaps of the vast empire he once ruled. The world remembers him in many ways: robber baron, philanthropist, monopolist, visionary. But above all, he remains a symbol of the paradox of American capitalism itself, its capacity for creation and destruction, for greed and generosity, for power and progress. John D. Rockefeller's story is not just the story of one man. It is the story of an age, and it still echoes in ours. By the time Ida Tarbell's History of the Standard Oil Company had finished serializing in McClure's magazine, America no longer saw John D. Rockefeller as a quiet man of faith, or even as a mere businessman. They saw him as a symbol, a living embodiment of monopoly power, an octopus with tentacles wrapped around pipelines, railroads, politicians, and even the Capitol itself. Tarbell had given the public what they had long suspected, but could not prove: evidence of secret rebates, predatory pricing, and aggressive buyouts. Her words stung because they were calm, factual, deliberate, the very style Rockefeller himself had long used. And for the first time in his life, Rockefeller found himself on the defensive. Political cartoons flooded newspapers. One week, Rockefeller was drawn as a bloated spider, spinning webs across the world. Another week, he was the head of a monstrous octopus, its tentacles clutching barrels, railroads, even the White House. His bald head and sharp features made him easy to caricature, instantly recognizable, endlessly repeatable. The term robber baron gained traction, applied to him, to Carnegie, to Vanderbilt, but more than anyone else, Rockefeller became its poster child. The man who had spent his life avoiding flamboyance, hiding behind quiet discipline, suddenly became the most hated and infamous face in America. And how did Rockefeller respond? With silence. Unlike Carnegie, who sparred with reporters and tried to charm the public, Rockefeller almost never defended himself directly. He refused interviews, issued only the most restrained statements, and carried on as if the storm did not exist. Friends and critics alike marveled at his composure. They called it stone-faced, stubborn, even arrogant. But to Rockefeller, it was strategy. He once said, "Never lose your temper, not even when the whole world seems to be against you." He lived that maxim. Where others raged at the newspapers, Rockefeller simply continued walking, head down, stride steady. But then came something curious. Even as journalists pursued him relentlessly, Rockefeller began handing out small silver dimes to children, to strangers, even to the very reporters who wrote mocking articles about him. It seemed absurd. The richest man in the world, a billionaire by modern standards, distributing coins worth 10 cents. Some saw it as condescension, a billionaire's mockery. Others saw it as kindness, a gesture of generosity. Still others thought it was a nervous quirk, a distraction from guilt. But Rockefeller never stopped. In parks, on golf courses, at train stations, always the dimes. Over the years, he handed out tens of thousands of them. And in doing so, he added a strange, almost folkloric layer to his public image. Reporters hounded him daily. They camped outside his estate. They followed him on walks. They shouted questions in the streets. Mr. Rockefeller, do you admit Standard Oil is a monopoly? Mr. Rockefeller, are you the richest man in the world? Mr. Rockefeller, what do you say to those who call you a robber baron? And time after time, Rockefeller smiled faintly, said nothing, and sometimes pressed a dime into the hand of the very man insulting him. This infuriated journalists. They wanted anger, quotes, conflict. Instead, Rockefeller offered silence and silver dot. In the process, he denied them control. They could caricature him, vilify him, but they could not provoke him. Rockefeller's public persona was increasingly a mask. In private, his health was failing. He suffered from alopecia, which left him bald and without eyebrows. His skin was pale and tight. His frame was thin, frail. The image of a monstrous octopus contrasted sharply with the reality of an aging man who looked almost spectral. But even in weakness, he projected calm. Golf became his therapy. Prayer became his anchor. Silence became his weapon. When crowds booed him, he simply smiled. When cartoonists mocked him, he ignored them. When politicians denounced him, he carried on with his philanthropy. And here lies the paradox. Privately, Rockefeller continued to live modestly, teaching Sunday school, donating millions, obsessing over efficiency in his charities. He read his Bible daily, tithed to his church, and spoke often of God's blessings. Publicly, he was the octopus, the robber baron, the monopolist, the villain of the progressive era. The two images clashed violently. Which was the real Rockefeller? The truth, perhaps, was both. Rockefeller's media wars shaped not just his own reputation, but the template for every powerful tycoon who followed. Carnegie tried to fight back with charm and public speeches. Morgan hid behind walls of bankers and secrecy, but Rockefeller showed that silence paired with eccentric gestures like the dimes could create an aura more powerful than words. In time, modern billionaires would wrestle with the same question. When the public hates you, do you fight back, or do you lean into the paradox and let the world argue about your image? Rockefeller proved that image could outlive reality. The octopus caricature remains famous even today, while the man's quiet generosity is often forgotten. So what do you think? Was Rockefeller's silence strength, or was it cowardice? Were the dimes acts of generosity, or of mockery? Was the man truly calm, or simply calculating? By the end of his life, Rockefeller had lost the public image war. No amount of dimes could erase the octopus. No quiet hymns could drown out Tarbell's words, and yet his philanthropy had planted seeds that would last far longer than headlines. The University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Foundation, his global health campaigns, these became his true monuments. History would never forgive him completely, but neither would it forget the lives he saved, the institutions he built, the diseases. He fought in silence, in caricature. In dimes, Rockefeller had proven something. You can control oil, you can control railroads, but you can never fully control your image. And that, perhaps, was the price of power. Act 1213 merged family, faith, and the legacy of capitalism, approximately 3,500 words. Opening scene, the man behind the empire. By the early 20th century, John D. Rockefeller was no longer just a businessman. He was a legend, a caricature, a symbol of monopoly and philanthropy. But behind the headlines, behind the octopus cartoons and the lawsuits, there remained a private man, a husband, a father, a grandfather, a man of strict Baptist faith, and the legacy he shaped at home would ripple out into the world, influencing not only his descendants, but also the entire structure of modern capitalism. The Rockefeller household, discipline at home, at his estate in Pocantico Hills. Known as Kykute, Rockefeller lived by the same discipline that had guided his career. Meals were plain, prayers regular, and waste forbidden. Even in wealth, extravagance was discouraged. He taught his children the same frugality he had learned from his mother Eliza. Every dime counted, every penny mattered. His only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., absorbed this ethos most deeply. While Rockefeller Sr. had built the empire, Jr. would spend his life preserving the fortune and channeling it into philanthropy. The daughters, too, married into influence, spreading the Rockefeller name into other powerful families. At family dinners, discipline was balanced with affection. Yet, the shadow of the empire always loomed. Every child knew that their surname carried weight. Faith, the Baptist bedrock. Religion was the axis of Rockefeller's private life. From boyhood, he tithed 10% of every income, even when that income was pennies. As his fortune grew, so did his donations, but always framed as an obligation to God rather than an act of indulgence. He taught Sunday school, carried his Bible everywhere, and lived as if thrift and generosity were two sides of the same coin. Critics accused him of hypocrisy. How could a man who crushed competitors claim to follow Christian charity? But Rockefeller himself never wavered. He saw no contradiction. Efficiency in business was, to him, God's work. Philanthropy was its natural completion. The dimes, again. Family folklore within the family. Rockefeller's dime-giving habit became folklore. Grandchildren remembered him always reaching into his pocket, always handing out the coin with a faint smile. To outsiders, it was eccentric. To his family, it was a lesson. Value small things, he seemed to say. Even the richest man in the world should never forget the worth of a dime. The Rockefeller dynasty, power across generations. Rockefeller's descendants extended his influence far beyond oil. John D. Rockefeller Jr. carried on philanthropy, funded Rockefeller Center in New York, and shaped the family fortune for generations. Nelson Rockefeller, Governor of New York, Vice President of the United States, and a symbol of the Rockefeller dynasty's political power. David Rockefeller, banker, chairman of Chase Manhattan, wielding enormous influence in finance and international relations. The family name became synonymous not just with wealth, but with political, cultural, and global influence. The Rockefellers were America's first dynasty of money, as recognized as kings or dukes in Europe. From family to system, Standard Oil's breakup and legacy. But Rockefeller's family legacy was only part of the story. His corporate legacy was just as vast. When the Supreme Court broke up Standard Oil in 1911, Many thought it was the end of his empire. Instead, it was its rebirth. The fragments became giants. Standard Oil of New Jersey gives Exxon, Standard Oil of New York gives Mobil, Standard Oil of California gives Chevron, Standard Oil of Indiana gives Amoco, Standard Oil of Ohio gives Sohio. Others merged, evolved, and eventually became part of BP and other global players. In short, the breakup created the modern oil industry. And Rockefeller, who owned stock in all of them, became wealthier than ever. The blueprint for modern capitalism, Rockefeller's methods, vertical integration, secret deals, predatory pricing, efficiency, obsession, became the blueprint for modern corporate strategy. Tech companies like Amazon and Google would later be accused of using Rockefeller-like tactics, controlling supply chains, undercutting competitors, expanding relentlessly into every aspect of an industry. Governments, too, learned from the Standard Oil case. Antitrust law, regulatory commissions, corporate oversight, all were shaped in response to Rockefeller. Every modern monopoly battle, from Microsoft in the 1990s to today's scrutiny of big tech, echoes the question first asked of Rockefeller: how much power is too much for one company or one man to hold? Rockefeller and modern philanthropy, and just as his business methods set precedents, so did his philanthropy. The Rockefeller Foundation became the model for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and others. Systematic, scientific, aimed at root causes, not mere charity, but social investment. Global health initiatives today, from malaria nets to vaccine drives, trace their lineage back to Rockefeller's campaigns against hookworm and yellow fever. Education, philanthropy owes him much. Universities, from Chicago to Spelman to Johns Hopkins, bear his fingerprints. The paradox in perspective, and so, Rockefeller's legacy sits in paradox. His business empire was broken as destructive to freedom, yet it created the foundation of global oil. His personal fortune was vilified as greed, yet it funded public health, science, and education. His image was hated in his time, yet his dynasty shaped American politics, finance, and culture for generations. He was not simply a man of his era. He was the mold from which modern capitalism was cast. Engagement prompt. Ask the viewer, so what do you think? If Standard Oil had never existed, would America have industrialized as quickly? If Rockefeller had not given away his fortune, would millions have remained sick, uneducated, in poverty? Was he a curse or a blessing to the world he changed? Closing scene, a family, a system, a shadow picture. The Rockefeller family at Kaikut, children laughing in gardens. Rockefeller himself, frail but smiling, dimes in his pocket. Now picture Exxon tankers, Chevron pipelines, mobile gas stations. Across the world, all fragments of Standard Oil, all descendants of his empire. And finally, picture a modern billionaire. Bill Gates funding vaccines, Jeff Bezos building logistics, Elon Musk building rockets. Each, knowingly or not, walking in Rockefeller's shadow, because the story of John D. Rockefeller was never just about oil. It was about the family he shaped, the dynasty he founded, and the capitalist system he transformed forever. From a hungry boy in rural New York, to a disciplined bookkeeper tracking every penny, to the architect of the most powerful monopoly in American history, to the world's first billionaire, and finally, to a philanthropist who gave away more money than anyone before him. The life of John D. Rockefeller reads like myth, and yet every detail is true. His story is not just about oil. It is about ambition, about discipline, about faith and power, greed and generosity, destruction and creation. It is about the paradox of a man who embodied the contradictions of capitalism itself. So how should we remember him? As the ruthless monopolist who bent railroads to his will, destroyed competitors, and dominated an industry? Or as the visionary philanthropist who built universities, funded science, and eradicated diseases across the world? The truth is, he was both. To the small refiners of Cleveland, Rockefeller was a nightmare, the calm, polite assassin of their dreams. To the sick children of the American South, freed from hookworm by his foundation, he was a savior. To politicians, he was a power broker. To students at the University of Chicago, he was a benefactor. Every narrative of Rockefeller is incomplete without its opposite. He was saint and sinner, builder and destroyer, benefactor and robber baron. What do we learn from Rockefeller's story? Discipline is destiny. From his mother, he learned thrift, honesty, and the power of pennies. From his father, cunning and calculation. Combined, these traits made him unstoppable. Control is power. While others gambled on drilling, Rockefeller mastered refining, shipping, and distribution. He understood that real wealth lies in controlling systems, not chasing luck. Monopoly provokes backlash. His consolidation of the oil industry brought efficiency, but also fear. And fear led to reform, to the Sherman Antitrust Act, to the breakup of Standard Oil. Philanthropy can redefine a legacy. His money built institutions that outlived him, universities, foundations, research labs. In giving, Rockefeller found a second life. Rockefeller's life forces us to rethink the American dream. Is it the story of a poor boy who, through hard work and discipline, rose to unimaginable success? Yes. Is it also the story of ruthless ambition, where success meant crushing competitors and bending rules? Also yes. The American dream, as Rockefeller lived it, was never simple. It was opportunity mixed with exploitation, faith mixed with ambition, generosity mixed with greed. And here's why Rockefeller still matters. Every debate we have today about billionaires, monopolies, and philanthropy echoes his story. When people ask if Amazon is too powerful, they are repeating the Standard Oil question. When critics accuse Google or Facebook of stifling competition, they are invoking Rockefeller. When Bill Gates invests billions in vaccines, or Elon Musk builds rockets and electric cars, they are walking in Rockefeller's shadow. He was the prototype, the original test case of what happens when wealth becomes power, and power shapes society. But here's the deeper question. Can money made ruthlessly be redeemed by generosity? If Rockefeller crushed competition to make his fortune, but then used that fortune to save millions of lives, how should we judge him? Do the ends justify the means? Or do the means forever stay in the ends? This is the paradox of great wealth. And it is not just Rockefeller's question. It is ours. So ask yourself, if you had Rockefeller's billions, what would you do? Would you hoard them, spend them, invest them? Or would you, like him, give them away in a systematic attempt to improve the world? And more importantly, how would you want history to remember you? When Rockefeller died in 1937 at the age of 97, the world mourned and marveled. Newspapers called him both saint and tyrant. Tributes flowed from universities, churches, and hospitals. Criticism lingered from businessmen and reformers. But in his rocking chair at Calcutta, handing out dimes to children, Rockefeller seemed at peace with the contradictions. Perhaps he knew that history would debate him forever. Perhaps he didn't care. In the end, John D. Rockefeller is not just a man. He is a symbol of what discipline can achieve, a symbol of what unchecked ambition can destroy, a symbol of the paradox of capitalism itself, its power to create prosperity, and its tendency to concentrate power. His story is our story, the story of modern America, the story of wealth, the story of how far ambition can take us, and how deeply it can divide us. And now, the question is yours. Was John D. Rockefeller the greatest builder of prosperity in American history, or its most dangerous monopolist? Do you see him as a visionary who lit the world, or as a tyrant who strangled competition? Tell us in the comments. We want to know what you think. And if you've stayed with us through this incredible journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into the hidden stories of history. Because Rockefeller's story may have ended in 1937, but the questions he raised still shape the world we live in today.